Good morning. My name is Gary Fox, and I'm the chair of the First Church Services Committee. I stumble over that every single time I do this. Welcome to First Parish Unitarian Universalist Canton. We are a welcoming, caring, and diverse faith community that serves to nurture and inspire each person's spiritual journey while serving others in our commitment to peace and justice. I'd like to welcome today's guest speaker. This is the Reverend Paul Sprecher. He was called to serve as minister at First Parish in Bridgewater last year after serving Second Parish in Hingham for 7 years. In other lifetimes, he taught 7th and 8th grade English and history for 10 years at the Collegiate School for Boys in New York City, and then started a new career as a computer consultant, and later as vice president for technology at the American Stock Exchange. Quite a varied background, so we welcome him today. And now let us enter into the spirit of worship.
Good morning. The opening words are by Jalaluddin Rumi, the 13th century Muslim Sufi mystic who was born in Afghanistan. Out beyond the ideas of wrongdoing and right-doing, there is a field. I'll meet you there. When the soul lies down in the grass, the world is too full to talk about. Ideas, language, even the phrase each other don't make any sense. Our opening hymn is in the gray hymnal, number 134. Our world is one world. Let's join together in singing. Please stand as you're willing and able. So this is a story from China. And it seems that two kingdoms, the kingdom of Yan and Zhang, were gathered on each side of their borders, and they were having a horrible war. It was a war that had gone on for year after year after year. And it was the kind of a war where there was a lot of destruction on either side. So one side would cross the border, burn some houses, destroy crops, and then they would make the people of the other country angry, and they would come across and they would do the same thing, and they couldn't figure out how to stop. Have you guys ever been in an argument where you don't quite know how to get out of it? And it goes on and on and on. Yeah, it's sort of like that. Or like you start hitting each other, and somebody does a gentle poke, and then the next person has to hit a little harder. Any of you ever experienced anything like this? Yeah. Sometimes when people get married, they start out, and they end up, And countries are like that. Right now, our political parties are kind of like that. We're kind of in this big fight between Democrats and Republicans, conservatives and liberals. So that's what was happening in this kingdom. And it was going on and on and on, year after year, decade after decade. And finally, an ambassador from Zhang made his way to the king of Yan, carrying a flag of truce, a white flag, right? About you carry a sign of peace with you. And he got to the king and he said, Your Majesty, I'd like to tell you a story. The king said, I'd love to hear a story from you. He said, as I was on my way here, I stopped on the bridge over a beautiful river with a pond on one side and the river running under. It was a beautiful day. It was sunny, and I paused for a minute just to look around and take in the scene. And I noticed an oyster sitting on a rock right on the side, sunning himself. His shell was open. He was getting the warmth. It was a very nice scene. And I noticed a snipe coming through the air in the direction of the oyster. Now, anybody know what a snipe looks like or sounds like? You ever heard of a snipe? No. We'll find out. Let's see. So there's a snipe. He has a very, very, very long beak, you see? And he has this funny call. You hear that guy? So that's the snipe. Now, as you can see, he has a very, very, very long beak. And so the snipe in our story noticed that there was this succulent morsel, an oyster with its shell wide open, and he came down very fast, got to the oyster, and the oyster snapped its shell shut. So now we have the snipe and the oyster like this. The oyster has grabbed the beak, the long beak of the snipe, and holds it very firmly. You might try that. Reach out to your friends. Reach out to somebody. And one of you be the oyster and one of you be the snipe, and just grab on. No, grab on with a finger. There you go. Right. And you're pulling as hard as you can, but you can't get out. So the ambassador said, I imagined that they were saying to each other something like this. The snipe, we imagine, said, I can hold on for a long time. You're going to get tired of this. You're going to open your shell, and I'm going to eat you. Well, the oyster said, in the mind of the ambassador, I'm going to hold on for a very long time. You can't fly away because I'm too heavy. You're going to starve to death before this is over. And so they hung on. I kept watching, said the ambassador. It was kind of an interesting scene. And as I was watching, I noticed a fisherman come along with a big net. And he put his net down over the snipe and the oyster and took it home for his dinner. The king was quiet. And then the ambassador said, you see, Your Majesty, what I'm afraid of is that if we continue in this endless conflict and weaken each other over and over and over again, the kingdom of Joe will come in. It's much more powerful, and if we're weakened, he will come in like that fisherman, clap down his net, and destroy the both of us. At which point the king stood up and said, I quit. We will no longer continue this war. Let us make peace between one another. Does that ever happen in battles that your guys are in? Does that ever happen when you finally realize, yeah, this is going on too long? Yeah. Well, that's the story that the ambassador told. Time now to sing you guys to your classes. Let's sing. We join together now in a time of prayer and meditation, a prayer of co-creation by Lynn Cox. Creative Spirit, source of life and love, we give thanks for the beauty of this day and for the company of those assembled here. Thank you for the breezes of change, clearing our heads and bringing fresh ideas. May they cleanse our minds of the oppressions and isms that divide us. Thank you for the flame of hope, the heat of righteous anger, the warmth of compassion, and the fire of commitment. May they bubble the cauldrons of transformation. Thank you for oceans of love, rivers of connection, tears of relief, and pools of serenity. May healing waters flow over us and through us and among us, wearing down the sharp rocks of despair to bring joy in the morning. Thank you for the good earth beneath us, around us, and within us. May we take this clay and co-create a new realm of justice and beauty. Thank you for all these and more. We accept our gifts and commit to building, sculpting, painting, singing, and dancing them to life, to abundant life. Amen. We're going to make a tiny change in the order of service and take the offering after the reading this morning. The reading is by Paul Roche. It's called Living It, Crossing Political Borders. It was a UUA General Assembly workshop right down in Providence in 2014. It was about crossing political borders. Paul Roche is one of the founders of the UU congregation in Sterling, Virginia. I grew up an Irish Catholic in Boston. Like many UUs, I left the Catholic Church early on, and my wife was not particularly enamored of her Armenian apostolic faith, but we eventually decided that we wanted some religious education for our children. Familiar story to many of us, including our family. I'd stumbled across Emerson's writing and was shocked to find how they resonated with me. So we sought out a UU church. The concept of a free and responsible for truth and meaning, search for truth and meaning was wonderful. And the fact that I could join others in a church setting to do so, I found nothing less than amazing. I craved a religion that would allow me to express and develop my own spirituality. Who knew one actually existed? We saw enough to like that we settled in as Unitarian Universalists. I'm a supporter, believer in, and fighter for human rights, most especially gay rights, women's reproductive rights, and immigration rights. I've held signs and engaged in conversations at my neighborhood polling places trying to prevent the Virginia anti-gay constitutional amendment from passing. For these things, my non-church friends and neighbors around the Washington, D.C. Beltway think I'm a crazy liberal. But I also believe that the greatest issue facing the U.S. is the imminent collapse of our economy, and that the way to fix it is primarily through lowering spending. For the latter and other positions seen as conservative, I'm deemed a crazy conservative by my UU friends and in church. The difference is In church, it hurts. When friends ask me about my religion, I extol its virtues, but I always have to caveat it with, if you can stand the politics. I do not like having to do that. We are a religious body that takes great pains to be inclusive in our language, our music, our readings, and so on, a noble and surprisingly difficult effort. We're engaged in the great work of transforming our congregations to be places of anti-racism, anti-classism, and anti-oppression of all kinds, and I strongly agree with that direction. It's my proposition that to be truly the church for the 21st century, we will need to welcome all those who share the love for our faith and its 7 principles, our dreams and our aspirations, but may believe there's a different political path to getting there. To accomplish this, we will need to affirmatively include in our screening lens political leaning. I'm saying the only way for us to really grow in numbers and indeed in spirit is by being inclusive in words and deeds to people who do not necessarily toe the Democratic Party line. It's my belief that if we would only let it be known that all are welcome at our table, that we covenant to be in right relation with everyone who walks through our doors, even people who might just have voted for Mitt Romney, people who might actually upset the UU apple cart a little bit, we could grow in real numbers. Not overnight, of course. There's a lot of soul searching that needs to be done first. But if we could tap the spiritual but unchurched folks who hold moderate political views, we could greatly increase our impact that our actions have on the world. We have a religion here that is too great to hide under the bushel basket of political dogma. Our UU light shines brightly, but we cloak it in political purity. Finally, as my friend Waldo says, a foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds. Think of the integrity we could foster by engaging all of our UU brain power in deeper discussion about the issues rather than jumping to partisan conclusions. So what needs to happen? How do we live this? Well, if you agree with us, and I hope you do, we need you to help do this welcoming work in your congregations. To be clear, I'm not asking you to change your political leanings. I'm asking you to be courageous and raise an objection when words of political derision are sprinkled in our sanctuaries. Call people on it. It's not the conservatives or moderates who will make these changes, nor is it just the liberals. It's all of us. Please be one of those who helps to begin this change. It's not just the right thing to do. I truly believe that our future as a religion depends upon it. Time now for the offering and offertory. Your gifts for the work of the congregation will be received. Please give generously.
Shall crowd into
When I was in 8th grade in 1963, our small farming town's middle school was consolidated with a nearby suburban school. I was coming from a small school in Cottage Grove, a farming community where each grade was about 25 and had its own classroom. We joined the suburb of Monona, a relatively affluent town right next to Madison, Wisconsin, where each grade had 4 sections. I was enamored at the time of right-wing politics. I grew up in a very conservative Pentecostal family. My brother, in fact, has been a Pentecostal minister for his entire life. So the politics were part of the conservative religion that I was growing up in. And I carried a briefcase with a bumper sticker on it that said AU H2O 64 splayed across it. Yes, I was a Goldwater fan. Now, as you can imagine, my briefcase in 8th grade with a bumper sticker on it made me stick out like a sore thumb. It was not the optimal way to impress the in crowd at a new school. And it happened that the kids from our township were all tracked into the middle or lower sections of the 4 groups in the 8th grade. I guess they assumed rural kids were dumb. And at some point early in the year, my teachers decided that I was misclassified and proposed that I switch to the upper track. Since I was new to the school, I'd barely made any friends. I didn't want to start all over again, so I said no. My English teacher yelled at me in class for being ungrateful. She said, "Your teachers only want what's best for you, and the principal would like to see you." Now, it turned out that C.F. Bain was a pretty unusual principal. He started our conversation by asking me what I was reading. I told him I was reading God and Man at Yale by William F. Buckley, his then decade-old diatribe against what he considered Yale's drift into secularism and to Keynesian economics, which he regarded as a slippery slope to collectivism and, gasp, socialism. Buckley concluded his chapter on economics by warning that, quote, individualism is dying at Yale and without a fight. And I was reading something from our conservative religious tradition, probably something like the 1835 Lectures on Revivals of Religion by Charles Grandison Finney. C.F. suggested, mildly, that I should try broadening my reading interests. He thought I might expand my horizons by reading Martin Buber and the theologian Paul Tillich, and maybe the economist John Kenneth Galbraith. And then finally, towards the end of our talk, he gently suggested that I would profit quite a bit if I agreed to transfer to the upper track, and I agreed. That was the beginning of a friendship that lasted for decades. The most dramatic bit was when I agreed to finish roofing a house he had bought during the summer of my junior year in college, and I fell off. It was about 25 feet to the ground. This accounts for the fact that my right arm still has limitations of motion, and also for the fact that I got out of the draft. As I was falling, I had the thought, at least I'll get out of the draft. Now, as it happens, the political tendency that Goldwater ran on, which is generally referred to as movement conservatism, is now the dominant ideology of the Republican Party. And we've come to a time in our national history when our political parties have almost no ideological overlap. The percentage of Democrats who call themselves conservatives is very low, and the same is true of Republicans who would call themselves liberals. So a chasm has opened between our parties, and more broadly between the red and the blue parts of our United States. And unfortunately, the dialogue between these political tendencies has more frequently turned to diatribe, especially of late. And we Unitarian Universalists are members of a liberal religion. Our religious commitments are in particular liberal in that we're creedless. We don't insist that everyone believe alike in matters of religious doctrine, and we welcome everyone regardless of their religious belief. Although, in truth, Christians sometimes feel less welcome than Buddhists in many of our congregations. So it's an easy extension of our religious liberalism to the assumption that we are politically liberal as well. And when we get into political questions, and by the way, our faith calls upon us to be active in the public square, many, if not most of us, would identify with the Democratic Party. 84%, according to a recent poll recorded in the UU World. So if someone were to express deep concern about the deficits that were incurred to help pull us out of the Great Recession, as does Paul Roche, for example, or to raise questions about rejecting regulations as a response to climate change and instead to promote free enterprise solutions instead, or, heaven forfend, to raise questions about too ready access to abortion, the instant response of most of us would be, but we're liberals! And that's a problem. As Paul Roche says in our reading this morning, it's my proposition that to be truly the church for the 21st century, we will need to welcome all those that share the love of our faith and our 7 principles, our dreams and our aspirations, but may believe there's a different political path to get there. We are liberal in religion, but that does not, in fact, entail that all of us are or should be liberal in politics. In many of our congregations, people who are drawn to our tolerance of a diversity of religious beliefs fairly quickly discover that our tolerance of political diversity is significantly less apparent. And I'm also very concerned about the degree to which our political differences are now driving us apart as a nation. I'm certainly not blind to the reality that the take no prisoners, always say no tactics of Republicans in Congress during the Obama administration have been mostly responsible for the paralysis in our ability to respond to national and international issues of great urgencies, a point that's attested by scholars for the conservative American Enterprise Institute think tank. But there is a real risk to our national solidarity when we find ourselves driven apart to such a degree that we can't even understand how people on the other side could possibly believe what they do. We find ourselves shouting denunciations across a grand canyon of incomprehension about the manifest stupidity of those people. So I went back to listen more closely to the politics I'd committed to when I was in 8th grade, before I came to believe that Goldwater was a risky bet for the country, that he would, for example, drag us more deeply into the war in Vietnam. Oh wait, that happened anyway, didn't it? It seemed to me that it would be useful to try to get a better sense of what movement conservatism really was and is about, if I was to have any hope of understanding the political beliefs of my relatives and of neighbors without automatically retreating to saying, but we're liberals. So I went back and I read a biography of William F. Buckley, and I got a better notion of how his politics were critically shaped by the experiences of his father, who was an entrepreneur in Mexico during the 1910 revolution there, and came to have a rather dim view of revolutions. I reread the chapters on economics in God and Man at Yale. I started rereading Barry Goldwater's Conscience of a Conservative. I read Ted Cruz's campaign autobiography, A Time for Truth. I learned that movement conservatism traces its roots back to the reaction of a few wealthy businessmen against the New Deal in the 1930s. And they went on then to found and support a number of conservative institutions that have in turn, over the years, significantly influenced public opinion against liberalism. The American Enterprise Institute, Heritage Foundation, Fox News, and many others. In fact, the roots of movement conservatism can sometimes be traced back much further to the disagreement between Thomas Paine and Edmund Burke about the French Revolution. I had to rethink whether the French Revolution was in fact a heroic blow for human freedom against the tyranny and backwardness of feudalism, or a much more complex social upheaval that in fact descended into terror, became deeply destructive, and led the way to Napoleon, founder of a new despotism fueled by endless wars of conquest. Don't worry, I haven't given up my political convictions. I haven't reverted to the political conscience of my 8th grade years, but I have gotten a better sense of the disagreements between conservatives and liberals. I actually found a lot to like about Ted Cruz, surprisingly, and I learned that his and my experiences growing up in our families were not as dissimilar as I might have thought. I found a lot to disagree with, and I found many of his arguments disingenuous. After all, we were both pretty good debaters in our youth, and we both learned how to frame arguments effectively, if not always quite accurately. And I've come to realize that if I don't pay attention to other political viewpoints, my own commitments are shallower than they could be. I think Paul Roche is right when he says, think of the integrity we would foster by engaging all of our UU brainpower in deeper discussions about the issues rather than jumping to partisan conclusions. So to help counter that kind of knee-jerk response of, but we're liberals, to anything that conservatives have to say, I want to begin to sketch what I hope is a more nuanced description of some of the foundations of the most critical political differences between conservatives and liberals. First, there's a fundamental disagreement about the nature of human beings, what we might refer to as our respective anthropologies. Our liberal religious traditions rejected the doctrine of original sin over 2 centuries ago. So, for example, I use these words in our child dedication ceremonies. Child dedication in our Unitarian Universalist congregations is not the same as baptism or christening, which symbolize a cleansing of original sin. We believe that children are born innocent, and that at the heart of that innocence lies the capacity for both good and ill. Now, any parent who believes that their child will remain an innocent and will display only signs of good will be disabused of the notion by the time they're about 2, if not well before that. And those of us who've tried more hands-off modes of discipline have often found ourselves with serious behavioral issues to deal with later on. The thing is that we human beings are frail. We're imperfect. We cannot, in fact, become everything we want to do, want to be, and we cannot always, in every circumstance, do only exactly the right thing. There are various stories to explain how humans came to be this way. There's the story of the Garden of Eden, which sketches an image of perfection, ease in the garden, followed by a fall into the difficulties of living in the real world. Then there's another story in Greek mythology, which tells the story of Pandora's box, how human beings were comfortable and happy until Pandora opened the box and let free all the horrors that beset human lives, and also hope, which can help us through some of the toughest times. Sometimes religious liberals can seem naive in not accepting that there's both good and evil in each of us, and not only in our opponents. We forget Alexander Solzhenitsyn's observation that the line between good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being. We have to bear in mind that we are not perfect, and that's one of the points that conservatives make. This imperfection means that we need boundaries, rules, clear directions, and consequences for bad behavior. So there follows from this a second significant difference about social order, one of the ways that we set common boundaries for all of us. Conservatives hold, for example, that some things are simply sacred in and of themselves. They, in general, see the Constitution as a virtually sacred document that must be interpreted exactly as the founders intended. Again, many of us who stood against the Vietnam War lost respect for our flag because it was co-opted as a particular symbol for the support of the war. And that's a problem because, in fact, the flag has a much broader meaning as a symbol of our United States. And when we allow it to be taken over as an exclusively conservative symbol, liberals can seem, by comparison, to be less patriotic. One of the issues of social order that I've been struck by, as highlighted in some of the conservative writings that I read, is the growing number of out-of-wedlock births. Now, our Puritan forebears in these pulpits would have regarded this as primarily a serious moral issue. My own concern is that the outcomes for children in families with only one parent are most often significantly worse when compared to families with two parents, regardless of the gender of the parents. Rates of lifelong poverty, of finishing high school, and in general of social mobility are often much worse in single-parent families. Single-parent families who are raising children in poverty are more likely to be raising children and grandchildren who will also live in significant poverty. In many cases, it's the result of single mothers being abandoned by fathers who choose not to help support their children. Some 40% of all births today in the United States now occur out of wedlock, much higher for African American and Hispanic, but 40% for everybody across the board. And the result is that in many cases, the children are suffering. Now, you and I may have different opinions about why this occurs and what, if anything, ought to be done about it, but it's an issue that we religious liberals ought to pay more attention to than most of us do, simply because we don't want to be moralistic. And then, finally, there are significant differences between liberals and conservatives in matters of international relations. There are, in fact, bullies on the world stage. Putin, for example, as conservatives like to point out. I happen to believe that fomenting intense hatred and reactivity against other nations tends to exacerbate conflicts as each side responds to escalations of hostilities from the other side, just like the story of our two kingdoms in China, the Snipe and the Oyster. So it's clearly worthwhile to engage in diplomacy with Iran, for example, just as it was with the Soviet Union during the Reagan presidency, the sainted Reagan presidency in the 1980s. But we also have to recognize that there are risks. We can say we want to give peace a chance, but there are sometimes in confrontation that require shows of strength as well. In facing Islamic extremism, ISIS, for example, we have to recognize that some of our enemies give us no choice but to restrain them by force. And of course, life is not all about politics. Paul Roche says this in another part of his presentation. A hungry family does not care that the person volunteering at the food pantry may have voted for John McCain. In the Washington, D.C. area, we're blessed to be in a huge melting pot of the world's peoples and faiths. When we break bread at interfaith events, no one asks for whom the guy who made the macaroni and cheese, me, voted. I don't care whether the lady who made the chicken korma voted at all. We're here to eat and sing and dance and get to know one another, breaking down barriers. Think, he says, about what we could accomplish in the way of human rights and real social justice if we grew substantially in numbers. We could then become a transformative force for our nation and the world, instead of being lumped in as other liberal religions in the Pew polls. So I hope that our Unitarian Universalist congregations can be more welcoming to a diversity of political opinions, alongside our welcoming of diversity in religious beliefs, and of people of every race, ethnicity, class, and gender orientation. I hope we can be welcoming across partisan lines, and that by listening closely, we can find common ground and help to bridge some of the yawning chasms that threaten to tear our nation apart. Your covenant here at First Parish, which we spoke this morning, and in many other congregations, commits you all to dwell together in peace with respect and understanding. With respect and understanding means listening first, listening deeply, and then formulating our own beliefs and opinions in dialogue with those we disagree with. Let us learn to listen deeply, to understand with compassion, and to dwell together in peace. May it be so, and amen. Our closing hymn is number 95, There is More Love, number 95. Closing words are from the covenant of the GA workshop at which Paul Roche spoke, Beyond Partisan Division. As we discuss our political and any other divisions, let us be quick to hear and slow to speak, respect the privacy of those who confide, speak our truth in love, offer absolutely no analogies that rely on Nazis, fascists, or Stalinist Russia, call others and be willing to be called back into covenant. Amen.